Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The atmospheric processor in Section 9 had been dying for 11 days. And for 11 days, the station's automated maintenance queue had been rescheduling its repair with the cheerful, bureaucratic optimism of a system that had never once been asked to account for the difference between scheduled and possible. Eli Carver had flagged it on day 3, had escalated it on day 6, had written on day 9 a maintenance report whose language a supervisor later described as unprofessional, and which Eli would have defended as accurate, and which contained, in its third paragraph, a sentence comparing the station's resource allocation protocol to a man standing in a burning building and carefully filling out a permit to purchase a fire extinguisher. The report had been acknowledged. The processor had continued dying. And so here Eli was, 14 hours into a shift that had been scheduled for 8, wearing a pair of gloves with a hole in the left index finger, crawling through an access shaft in the belly of Meridian Outpost Kira-7, with a repair kit that was missing a coupling wrench and a torch that was on its 4th battery cycle, and beginning to express opinions about it. Kira-7 was not, by any measure anyone had ever applied to it, a remarkable station. It existed in the comfortable and profitable middle distance, between two more important places. The kind of installation that appeared on star charts as a waypoint, and in budget meetings as a line item, and in the lived experience of its 412 permanent residents as simply home, imperfect, familiar, smelling faintly of recycled air and machine oil, and the particular brand of canteen coffee that Eli had stopped tasting 3 years ago, and now consumed purely as a biological maintenance requirement. The station was old. Not historically old, not the kind of old that gets a preservation order and a plaque, just the practical, unglamorous old of infrastructure that has been running past its service dates on goodwill and the stubbornness of its maintenance crew. The joints groaned. The environmental seals developed opinions. The power grid, on cold cycles, would occasionally express itself through the lighting in ways that made the lower corridors feel like the opening sequence of a horror program. Eli had learned to read the station the way you learn to read any old, complicated thing that you're responsible for keeping alive. Not from its official specifications, which were optimistic, but from its sounds and its silences, from the vibration in the walls and the particular quality of the air in a corridor where something was beginning to fail. Tonight the air in Section 9 had a quality Eli did not like: thin. Not dangerously thin, not yet, not in the corridor itself, but with the particular flatness that meant the processor servicing the section was no longer doing its full job, no longer cycling and filtering and returning air to the 47 dock workers sleeping beyond the bulkhead, with the uncomplicated faith of people who had no reason to know that breathable air required maintenance. Eli thought about those 47 people with some regularity during the crawl through the access shaft. It was motivating, in the way that specific, human consequences are always more motivating than abstract ones. Not section atmospheric failure, which was a phrase in a report. 47 people, sleeping, trusting the pipes, somewhere above, 4 decks above, in a part of the station that had been cleaned and repressurized and optimized with a thoroughness that the maintenance corridors had never in their structural lives experienced. History was, apparently, being made. Eli was aware of the diplomatic visit the way you're aware of weather in a city you're not in. Theoretically, as a fact, without any personal stake in its outcome. The celestial sovereign of the Vahari Continuum. First formal contact in 11 years. Protocol teams had been on the station for a week, and their relationship with the maintenance crew had been one of mutual incomprehension conducted at high volume, culminating in a moment 3 days ago when a protocol officer had asked Eli to reroute a conduit to improve the aesthetic flow of a reception corridor, and Eli had explained, with the careful patience of someone explaining something for the last time, that the conduit in question was carrying oxygenated air to the medical bay. The officer had found a different solution. Eli had considered this a productive interaction. The processor was worse up close. Eli wedged into the access hatch and pulled up the diagnostic panel and looked at the readout with the expression of someone who had suspected bad news and was finding that the news had exceeded the suspicion. 3 of the 7 filtration arrays had already failed over. A fourth was running at 31%. The bypass coupling that should have compensated for the loss was seized. Not broken, not burnt, just seized, corroded at the joint in a way that spoke of deferred maintenance and false economies, and a budget cycle that had prioritized the reception corridor's atmospheric profile over the machinery that kept human beings breathing in their sleep. Eli reached into the access shaft and got to work, and did not think about the hour, and did not think about the fact that the torch was beginning to flicker, and did not think about the heaviness behind the eyes that had stopped being a feeling, and started being a physical weight somewhere around hour 12. There was a repair to finish. There were 47 people sleeping on the other side of a bulkhead, and they would wake up to good air, or Eli would know the reason why. The torch flickered. The processor groaned. The air in the shaft recycled quietly through Eli's lungs, a little stale, a little close, the specific atmosphere of a small enclosed space in which someone has been breathing for longer than recommended. Eli reached deeper into the machine's guts and found the seized coupling and began the patient, methodical work of persuading it to move. The station hummed around the access shaft with its old, complicated life. 4 decks above, history continued without requiring Eli's participation. And somewhere around hour 18, deep inside the wall of Section 9, the body made a decision that the mind was not consulted about, and the torch hit the floor of the access shaft, and Eli Carver's last conscious thought was not peaceful, and was not resigned, but was the flat, furious awareness of someone who has just realized they are going to be very annoyed about this later, assuming later arrives, and then the thought dissolved, and the darkness that replaced it was total, and the processor kept dying in the quiet, and the 47 people slept on, not knowing. The quarters assigned to the celestial sovereign of the Vahari Continuum were, by any standard the Union's protocol division was equipped to apply, exceptional. This was the problem. They were exceptional in the way that a very expensive, very careful reproduction of a thing is exceptional, technically accomplished, aesthetically committed, and possessed of a quality that the original would never have, which was the quality of trying. The atmospheric mixture had been recalibrated to Vahari tolerances by a team of 3 environmental specialists who had spent 6 days on it and were justifiably proud of themselves. The lighting had been shifted into the blue-violet spectrum. The humidity had been adjusted. Someone, in a gesture of cultural research that Valith found genuinely touching, had sourced a piece of music composed in the Vahari tonal tradition, approximately 400 years out of date, she noted, but sincerely meant, and loaded it into the quarter's ambient system. It played softly from somewhere in the ceiling, a melody that belonged to a composer who had been dead for 4 centuries, and who would have been extremely surprised to learn their work was being used to help a sovereign sleep on a human way station in a system they had no name for. Valith was not sleeping. She lay on the sleeping surface, another careful reproduction, the angles approximating a Vahari rest form without quite achieving it. In the same way that a chair designed by someone who has only ever read about chairs approximates sitting, and looked at the ceiling and breathed the air that was almost right, and listened to the music that was almost right, and felt the particular, low-grade dissatisfaction of being in a place that had worked very hard to accommodate her, and had succeeded only in making the distance between itself and home more precise. This was not ingratitude. She had met the environmental team and thanked them with complete sincerity. It was simply that almost right and right were not the same measurement, and her body, whatever her mind elected to do about it, knew the difference. She rose at 2:40, station time. She dressed practically, which was to say she dressed in a way that would have caused her formal attendants significant distress if they had been present to witness it, which they were not. Because Valeth had a well-established and fully reciprocal relationship with her attendants, in which she did not ask them to accompany her on nighttime walks, and they maintained, in return, the professional dignity of people who had decided there were certain battles not worth fighting. She had been having nighttime walks since she was 12 years old. No attendant had ever successfully prevented one. At some point, the Corps had collectively arrived at the strategic wisdom of simply tracking her vital signs from a distance and pretending, in the morning, that they had known where she was the entire time. The station's maintenance corridors were accessed from the diplomatic quarters through a secondary environmental panel that had not been locked, because it had not occurred to anyone that the Sovereign would find it. This was a category of oversight that Valeth was, across many years and many stations, quite used to. People prepared extensively for where they expected her to be. They prepared considerably less for where she went when the air was wrong, and the ceiling was offering no useful information, and her body had made its position on sleep perfectly clear. She followed her nose, which was the accurate and mildly inelegant way of describing what she was doing. Vahari olfactory sensitivity was a fact that appeared in xenobiology texts and diplomatic briefings with the same tone, noted, catalogued, politely not commented upon in her presence. What the texts captured less successfully was what it meant in practice, which was that Valeth moved through the station's maintenance corridors the way a person moves through a room they know well in the dark. Not cautiously, but with a reading of the space that had nothing to do with her eyes. She could smell the age of the seals in the walls. She could smell where the insulation on a power conduit had begun, slowly, to break down. She could smell the atmospheric difference between a corridor that was being properly cycled and one that was receiving a diminished supply. And it was this last thing that pulled her deeper into the lower decks, past junctions that no protocol officer had walked, through passages that existed in the station schematics as maintenance access routes, and in practice as the connective tissue of a living place. Unglamorous, essential, entirely honest. She found the torch first. It was lying on the floor of the access shaft approach, still faintly warm, the way things are when they've been recently dropped rather than simply misplaced. Then she found the diagnostic panel, still open, its readout displaying numbers that even a non-specialist could interpret as bad news. Then she found Eli Carver, and she did what her biology had been doing without her conscious approval for the entire history of her species, which was to say, she did the only thing available to a Vahari who finds an injured packmate in an enclosed space. She pulled the unconscious technician carefully, methodically, out of the access shaft. She checked the breathing, shallow, irregular, the specific rhythm of hypoxic unconsciousness. Nothing she hadn't assessed before, nothing her training hadn't covered. But the assessment triggered the same cascade it always triggered, the neurological sequence that ran underneath rational thought and considerably faster. She settled on the corridor floor. She gathered Eli against her chest and felt the slow, too thin pulse against her palm, and adjusted the angle to open the airway. And with her other hand, she opened her communications link and spoke to the station's medical team in the level, unhurried tone of someone who was in control of the situation and intended to remain so. Then she waited. The maintenance corridor was cold and lit with the functional, unkind lighting of a space built for utility rather than comfort, and it smelled of metal and old seals and the particular flatness of recycled air running through dying machinery. And Valeth sat in the middle of it with a sleeping stranger pressed against her collarbone, and found, with some surprise, that it was the most comfortable she had felt since arriving on the station. The air here was not optimized. It was not recalibrated or approximated or reproduced from careful research. It was simply what it was, imperfect, honest smelling of real work, and her lungs, for the first time since she had stepped off the diplomatic transport, did not spend any effort noticing the difference between this place and home. Consciousness returned to Eli Carver the way power returns to a station after an emergency shutdown. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in stuttering, unreliable stages that each promised more than they delivered. There was warmth first, which was wrong, because the access shaft had been cold, and the floor of Section 9's maintenance corridor was not the kind of surface associated with warmth in any documentation Eli had ever read. There was a sound, a slow, double-beat rhythm, slightly too measured, with that second beat at the end that the still rebooting brain logged as unusual before it had the processing capacity to investigate why. There was the sensation of being held, which was so far outside the expected parameters of waking up mid-repair that Eli's nervous system simply filed it under pending and moved on to higher priority concerns, like whether the eyes were going to cooperate. They cooperated. Eli opened them into a pair of eyes looking down from approximately 30 centimeters away, gold, still, vertical-pupiled, belonging to a face that was almost familiar in its arrangement and entirely unfamiliar in its specifics, and which was currently wearing the expression of someone monitoring a situation with complete, focused calm. The brain, now sufficiently online to be dangerous, offered several possible explanations for the available evidence, considered each of them briefly, and concluded that none of them were satisfying. Eli said, "I'm going to need you to explain this in very small sentences." The celestial sovereign of the Vahari Continuum, who had been sitting on a maintenance corridor floor for 22 minutes cradling an unconscious station technician, and had presumably spent that time thinking about many things, appeared to consider this request seriously. "You lost consciousness," she said. "I found you. I am holding you until the medical team confirms you are stable. They are coming." That's 3 sentences. They were small. The medical team arrived 40 seconds later, which was impressive response time, and which Eli would have appreciated more if the team's arrival hadn't been immediately complicated by the fact that the patient was in the arms of someone whose authority extended over a significant portion of the known inhabited galaxy, and who showed no indication of releasing them. The lead medic, a composed, experienced woman named Carver, who had handled medical emergencies on 4 different stations and 2 deep space transports, and had believed, until this moment, that she had encountered the full range of situations her profession could produce, stopped in the entrance to the corridor, took a single long look at the configuration of the scene, and began her assessment with the careful professionalism of someone who had decided the context was above her clearance level, and the patient was not. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked Eli. "Eli Carver, maintenance 3rd class. The processor in 9C is partially repaired. Someone needs to finish the bypass on the 4th filtration array or Section 9 loses atmospheric integrity by morning. I want that noted." Carver noted it. "And do you know where you are?" "Maintenance corridor, Section 9 approach. I'm also being held by the sovereign of the Vahari Continuum, which I would like noted as well, because I feel it's the kind of detail that loses something if it's left out of the record." Carver agreed that it would be noted. She began running her scanner with the practiced efficiency of someone working around a diplomatic complication she had not been trained for and was not being paid enough to have feelings about. The handlers arrived next. There were 3 of them, moving in that specific, controlled way of people managing a crisis they were professionally required to describe as a situation. They took in Valith on the floor, Eli in Valith's arms, the medical team working carefully around the geometric problem of the sovereign's continued hold, and the general atmosphere of the maintenance corridor, which had not improved aesthetically since Valith had arrived in it, and held a conversation with their eyes that lasted approximately 4 seconds and concluded in shared, silent acceptance. The senior handler, a man named Brecht who had been managing Vahari diplomatic relations for 9 years and had aged, in those 9 years, in a way that suggested the job had opinions about his timeline, stepped forward and said, with extraordinary diplomatic composure, "Sovereign, we were concerned." "I sent the medical notification," Valeth said. "You did, we were still concerned. The technician needed monitoring. I was monitoring." Brecht absorbed this, of course. He looked at Eli with the expression of a man filing away an experience for a memoir he would write someday, when the clearance allowed. "Are you comfortable?" Eli considered the thermal warmth, the secure hold, the fact that they were currently breathing better than they had been for the last several hours. "Physically, yes. Existentially, I'm still catching up." The explanation came in stages, delivered by Valeth in the unhurried, matter-of-fact way she apparently delivered most things, as though the information were simply true, and the universe's opinion about how unusual it sounded was the universe's own business to sort out. Pack biology, evolutionary architecture, the neurological cascade triggered by proximity to an injured being, any being, once the classification had been made, and the classification happened fast, faster than conscious thought, and could not be reversed mid-process any more than a reflex could be interrupted by politely asking it to reconsider. The Vahari had been pack hunters for long enough that the relevant neural pathways had stopped being instinct and become something closer to structure. You did not leave an injured packmate. The instruction was not in the mind. It was in the architecture. The station's chief of protocol arrived midway through this explanation. She stopped at the corridor entrance, looked at the scene with the comprehensive, evaluating look of a woman whose entire professional existence was built on anticipating situations before they developed, and who was currently standing in front of evidence that the universe was still capable of surprising her. She looked at Eli. She looked at Valeth. She looked at the diagnostic panel still open on the wall, at the torch still on the floor, at the readout still displaying the numbers of a machine that had been dying for 11 days. She looked at Brecht, who offered her a very small, very honest shrug. She turned around and went to find coffee. This was, Eli would later reflect, the most relatable thing anyone did that night. "So," Eli said, when the explanation had reached its conclusion, and Akafor had confirmed with her scanner that the patient's oxygen saturation was returning to acceptable levels, and the corridor had achieved a kind of absurd equilibrium that nobody seemed to know how to break. "You've basically adopted me." Valeth considered this for a moment with the particular quality of attention she seemed to bring to everything, total, unbothered, as though the question were interesting rather than extraordinary. "The word your language uses for it is imprecise," she said, "but it is not entirely wrong." Akafor cleared her throat. "The patient's saturation is at 94%. I'd like to move them to the medical bay when—" She gestured at the situation with her scanner in a way that communicated a complete sentence without requiring one. Valeth looked down at Eli with those gold, unhurried eyes. The double beat of her pulse was slower now, the monitoring function cycling down the way it did when the emergency had resolved into the manageable. Her hold shifted, not releasing, not yet, but changing quality, moving from the focused grip of biological necessity toward something else, something that had no clinical name in either of their languages. "Your processor," she said. "Section 9, the bypass you mentioned." Eli blinked. Of everything available to follow from the preceding 10 minutes, this had not been the expected direction. "What about it?" "It will be repaired. As soon as Akafor clears me, yes." "Tonight." Eli looked at Akafor. Akafor looked back with an expression that said she had opinions about this, and they were medical in nature. "That depends on the medical bay," Eli said carefully. "The 47 people in Section 9, Valeth said. It was not a question. It was a confirmation, the way you confirm a thing you already understood, spoken aloud for the purpose of making clear that you understood it. Something shifted in the corridor, not physically, not atmospherically, but in the less measurable way that the weight of a moment shifts when two people are paying attention to the same thing at the same time." "Yeah," Eli said. Them. Valith released her hold. It was deliberate and complete, the clean conclusion of a biological sequence that had run its course, and she helped Eli to sit upright on the corridor floor with the same careful, methodical attention she had given everything else. The medical team moved in immediately, professional and relieved, and began the practical business of getting the patient onto a stretcher. And the handlers began the diplomatic business of getting the sovereign back toward the upper decks, and the corridor filled with the organized noise of a situation resolving itself into something that could be written in a report. Eli sat on the stretcher and watched Valith stand, and thought about the way she had said 47 people, not as a number, not as a variable in a problem, but as the specific human weight of the thing, the same weight Eli had been carrying through 18 hours and an access shaft, and the long, unglamorous dark of a shift that history had not noticed and would not record. The corridor lights buzzed overhead, indifferent and institutional. Somewhere in Section 9, the processor was still waiting. The medical bay on Kira-7 was, like most things on Kira-7, functional in the way that a thing is functional when nobody has allocated budget for it to be anything more. The beds were narrow. The diagnostic equipment was 2 generations behind current standard. The ceiling had a water stain in the shape of something Eli had decided, during a previous visit 18 months ago, looked like the Cygnus constellation, and which had not been repaired since, and which Eli now regarded as a kind of old acquaintance. Eli lay under it and breathed the oxygen the system was feeding through the mask and felt, with the specific and unfamiliar quality of someone encountering a thing they had forgotten existed, something close to stillness. The repair had been finished. This was the first thing Eli had confirmed upon waking in the medical bay, not because the medical bay had offered the information, but because Eli had asked, with enough persistence that Carver had eventually calmed the maintenance supervisor on the night rotation, just to produce an answer and restore some professional peace. Technician Reyes had completed the bypass on the 4th filtration array at 4:41 hours. Section 9's atmospheric readings had normalized by 5:10. The 47 dock workers had woken up to good air, eaten breakfast, complained about the canteen's protein allocation, and gone about their day without ever knowing that the margin between their morning and a very different kind of morning had been, at its narrowest, one seized coupling and one unconscious technician in a wall. Eli stared at the Cygnus stain and found, somewhat to their own surprise, that this was enough. Not the recognition. There would be no recognition. The maintenance log would record the repair as completed on schedule, which was the kind of fiction the scheduling system told itself to preserve internal consistency. But the fact of it, the air, the 47 people, the thing done. Eli had been doing this work for 6 years on this station and had never once needed the ledger to balance in any currency other than the one it always balanced in, which was the quiet, private knowledge that the systems were running and the people behind the bulkheads were breathing, and today was not the day something failed that didn't have to fail. That had always been sufficient. Eli was only now noticing, lying in a medical bay with supplemental oxygen and the first genuine rest in 20 hours, that it was also, in its own unglamorous way, a kind of wholeness. That the work had always been the point of the work, and the invisibility of it had never actually diminished it, only hidden it, and those were not the same thing. The door opened at 9:30, and it was not Carver. The 2 attendants who entered first were the ones Eli recognized from the corridor, the pair who had arrived, assessed the situation, and assumed the posture of people who had made their peace with their sovereign's habits and were no longer filing objections. They took positions on either side of the door with the practiced neutrality of people who were present without being intrusive, which was, Eli had... She looked at the Cygnus stain on the ceiling. She looked at Eli. The processor, she said. Finished at 4:41, Eli said. Rays on the night rotation. Good technician. Valith nodded and sat down in the chair beside the bed, with the same quality of calm she had brought to the maintenance corridor floor, as though whatever surface she chose to occupy became, by her presence on it, exactly as appropriate as any other surface. The attendants did not react. Eli had a feeling they had long ago stopped reacting to things like this. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Significantly better than I did inside the wall," Eli said. "The oxygen helps. Also, I've had 4 hours of sleep, which is the longest uninterrupted stretch I've managed in about a week. So there's some irony in the fact that I had to pass out in a maintenance shaft to get it. Your body made the decision your judgment was refusing to make. My body is not in charge of the maintenance schedule." "Your body," Valeth said, disagreed. Eli considered this for a moment and found, without particular resistance, that it was true. The shift had been hour 18, when the body had overruled the decision. Hour 18, processing an argument that had been running since approximately hour 10, which was the argument between the part of Eli that understood a human organism, had operational limits, and the part that had looked at the Section 9 diagnostic readout and understood, with a clarity that made limits feel like someone else's problem, that the processor was not going to wait for Eli to be rested. The processor had won that argument for 11 days. The body had finally cast the deciding vote, and the vote had been ugly, and Eli was not, sitting here with good oxygen and a cleared saturation reading, going to pretend that the ugliness was heroic. It had just been the way the arithmetic worked out when you subtracted adequate staffing and a functioning maintenance budget from a station that needed both. Eli said this, or most of it, in the direct and unguarded way that hospital beds and 20 hours of sustained stress seem to produce in people who would otherwise be more careful. Valeth listened with the quality of attention that Eli had noticed in the corridor. Complete, still, the kind of listening that has no agenda running underneath it, that is not assembling a response while the other person speaks, but is simply receiving what is said and treating it as worth receiving. It was, Eli thought, a surprisingly rare thing to encounter, and particularly surprising to encounter here, in a medical bay on a mid-tier way station, from the ruler of a civilization that had been navigating interstellar space since before humanity had a written alphabet. She asked questions. Not the diplomatic kind, not the kind designed to produce usable information or position a conversation toward a predetermined conclusion, but the genuinely curious kind, about the station, about the work, about what it meant to be the person who understood a place well enough to hear what it was trying to say before it started saying it loudly. She asked about the coupling that had seized, about what caused it, about whether the budget that had allowed it to happen was a problem specific to Kira-7 or a systemic condition of the Union's infrastructure maintenance model. Eli answered all of it, and the answer to the last question was long and not entirely diplomatic, and Valeth listened to all of it without the expression of a person who was going to file the conversation away and do nothing with it. "You are going to stay," she said when the answer was finished. It was not quite a question. Eli looked at her. "On Kira-7. Doing this work." It landed differently than it would have landed 48 hours ago. Eli thought about the report that had used the word accurate and been described as unprofessional. Thought about the 11-day repair queue. Thought about the 47 people and the good air, and the fact that technician Rays had been there to finish the bypass, because Eli had trained Rays 2 years ago in this same bay of corridors, on machines exactly like the one that had nearly killed Eli last night. Thought about the Cygnus stain and the narrow bed and the canteen coffee that had no taste anymore, and the deep, structural knowledge of a place that only came from staying inside it long enough to understand all the ways it could fail. "Yes," Eli said. Valeth was quiet for a moment. The attendant stood their unobtrusive post by the door. Outside the medical bay, the station went about its morning with the ordinary, unheroic industry of a place that had been running since before the diplomatic visit, and would be running long after it. serviced by people whose names would not appear in any account of the 11-year relationship between the Vahari Continuum and the Interstellar Union, and without whom the relationship would have had considerably less breathable air to unfold in. "I would like," Valeth said, choosing the words with the careful precision of someone who was not, for once, speaking in a diplomatic register but in a more personal one, "to know how the station performs in the coming months, whether the systems hold." She paused, "whether the budget allocation is corrected." Eli looked at her for a long moment. "That's a specific interest for someone whose state visit ends tomorrow." "I have," Valeth said, "a particular relationship with this station now." She said it simply, without weight, the way you state a fact you have already decided is true. "My neurology has opinions about it." Eli thought about the double-beat pulse, the maintenance corridor floor, the arm that had not released until the scanner read 94%. Thought about being classified by an evolutionary architecture millions of years older than the station as something worth not leaving alone in the dark. "The budget allocation," Eli said, "is going to take an act of God or a very strongly worded letter from someone with sufficient authority to make the relevant administrators nervous." Valeth's expression did something subtle and precise that Eli was only beginning to learn how to read. "I have," she said, "written letters before." Outside, the station hummed through its morning, the corridors cycling their air, the processors running, the dock workers moving cargo through Section 9 without knowing and without needing to know what the night had required to make the morning ordinary. The diplomat